Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different.
Yeah, usually we look at trends, right? Over weeks or months, try to see the bigger picture unfolding over time.
Exactly. But today, we are zooming right in, forensically you might say, on one single incredibly high-stakes day, October 30th, 2025.
And what a day. I mean, if you wanted a snapshot, just 24 hours illustrating a world pulling in completely opposite directions, this was it.
That's the perfect description. You've got these extreme global strategic moves happening, big escalations, clashing head-on with, well, just total gridlock and paralysis at home, at least in the U.S. context.
Right. So our mission here, looking at all this source material we've gathered, is really to try and cut through the sheer volume of noise, find the signal within those 24 hours.
Find the signal. I like that. Because it felt overwhelming just looking at the headlines from that one day.
It really was. And the sources, they paint this picture of, major powers making these huge, potentially irreversible decisions. We're talking long-term stuff.
Like on nuclear strategy, which we'll get into, or this massive AI race everyone's suddenly pouring billions into.
Exactly. While at the exact same time getting completely bogged down in these messy short-term political fights, domestic crises, shutdowns.
And the contradictions are just,
Well,
they're startling. You've got the U.S. president issuing a directive to restart nuclear weapons testing. First time in 33 years.
a massive, massive strategic move. Really changes the game.
While back home, the federal government is paralyzed by a shutdown. And on that very same day, October 30th, over 40 million Americans, they lose their essential food aid, SNAP benefits, just gone.
It's incredibly stark, isn't it, the contrast? And globally, things were just as fractured. You had the high drama of a U.S. China trade truce being hammered out in Busan.
Right, suggesting maybe a bit of a diplomatic thaw,
Yeah,
some breathing room.
maybe. That was the hope anyway. But then look across the globe to Ukraine. Russia unleashes one of the largest aerial barrages of the entire war, hitting the vital energy grid really hard.
And then there's the economic angle, big tech. Basically shocking the markets by revealing the absolutely astronomical cost of this AI arms race.
Billions upon billions, maybe trillions in the long run. It suddenly felt very real.
So yeah, that's our canvas for this deep dive, trying to get a handle on how these monumental, maybe irreversible decisions and this frustrating, paralyzing short-term gridlock all came together to define October 30th, 2025.
Okay, let's dig in. Where do we start?
I think we have to start right here in the U.S. With that dramatic conflict you mentioned, massive executive action clashing directly with this persistent domestic stalemate. And the place to begin, I think, has to be what I can only describe as the nuclear bombshell.
Yeah.
Because this single development, it feels like it has the capacity to just fundamentally rewrite decades of U.S. strategy and, global non-proliferation efforts.
It really does. And what's fascinating here, as you said, isn't just the content of the order, but the timing and the delivery. On October 30th, President Trump directed the Pentagon publicly to immediately resume U.S. nuclear weapons testing.
Immediately. Not study it, not consider it. Resume.
Exactly. This isn't some subtle diplomatic signal. It's an immediate, high-decibel strategic escalation, a clear break.
And maybe we should just underline the significance for you, the listener. This is a colossal break with precedent. Since way back in 1992, for 33 years, the U.S. has maintained a de facto moratorium on full-scale nuclear explosive testing.
That's right. We haven't detonated a nuclear weapon in all that time. The U.S. has relied on alternatives to, ensure the reliability and safety of the existing arsenal without actual explosive tests.
What kind of alternatives are we talking about?
Well, for over 3 decades, the strategy involved using really advanced computer simulations, modeling the physics of an explosion, and also something called subcritical tests.
Subcritical, what does that mean exactly?
Okay, so subcritical tests use actual nuclear materials like plutonium and chemical high explosives, but they're configured in a way that they don't achieve critical mass. So you don't get a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, no nuclear yield, no boom.
Ah, okay, so you can test components, maybe the physics package, but not the whole weapon going off.
Precisely. It gives you data on aging materials, component function, that sort of thing, without breaking the testing moratorium. This new order from the White House on October 30th just ends that explicit policy constraint. Full stop.
So why now? Why this sudden, very dramatic change? What was the administration's justification, according to the sources?
The official framing, the justification put forward, was that restarting testing was absolutely necessary for 2 main reasons: ensuring the reliability of the aging U.S. stockpile and bolstering deterrence.
Deterrence against who?
They specifically cited perceived advances by adversaries, pointing to Russia, which had been, publicly touting novel weapon systems, hypersonic missiles, things like that, and also China, which analysis showed was rapidly expanding and modernizing its own nuclear arsenal. The argument was basically, we can't afford to fall behind based just on simulations.
And the timing. You mentioned the time.
Oh, the geopolitical staging of this was, well, you could call it masterful or maybe disastrous, depending on your view. The public order was delivered just hours before President Trump was scheduled to meet with China's President Xi Jinping in Busan, South Korea.
Wow. Talk about setting a tone.
Exactly. It served as an immediate, very pointed strategic escalation right before a supposedly delicate diplomatic dialogue was about to begin. Highly provocative, to say the least.
Okay, you mentioned the gravity of this. What were the specific geopolitical consequences that arms control experts immediately started warning about? What were they worried would happen next?
They were, frankly, universally alarmed. The warnings came thick and fast. The biggest fear was that this could completely unravel the global norms against testing that have held more or less for decades.
Because the U.S. hasn't actually ratified the main treaty, right?
Correct. The U.S. signed the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, back in the 90s, but the Senate never ratified it. So we've observed the moratorium voluntarily. By taking this step now, the U.S. effectively gives political cover to Russia and China, neither of whom have fully ratified the treaty, either to immediately follow suit.
So the fear is tit for tat.
Exactly. The immediate fear was reciprocal testing. Russia tests, China tests, perhaps others down the line, triggering a brand new, highly destabilizing nuclear arms race, basically undoing decades of incredibly painstaking non-proliferation work.
And presumably it complicates diplomacy beyond just Russia and China, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if the U.S., a major nuclear power, restarts testing, what message does that send to countries like, say, Iran or North Korea about non-proliferation goals?
It pretty much cripples those efforts, frankly. It strips the U.S. of a crucial moral and diplomatic high ground. How can you credibly pressure others not to develop or test weapons when you're resuming testing yourself?
Right. It makes future strategic stability talks vastly more complicated.
Immensely so. And analysts immediately warned it would incite significant diplomatic fallout, not just with adversaries, but critically with our closest allies, particularly non-nuclear allies in Europe and Asia, who rely heavily on U.S. adherence to these global norms for their own security.
So this single executive action on October 30th, it feels like it fundamentally altered the strategic landscape for potentially the next decade or more.
No question. A really pivotal moment. Hashtag 1.2, the tariff tangle, and legislative pushback.
It's truly immense. But here's where that contradiction we talked about really comes into play. Because while the executive branch was unilaterally flexing its muscles on the global stage with this huge nuclear policy shift, domestically on trade policy, it was facing intense pushback. Legislative resistance, what we're calling the tariff tangle.
Yes, it's quite the contrast. On the very same day that the nuclear testing order went out, the U.S. Senate actually took a significant vote against the administration's trade policy. They voted 51-47 to repeal the national emergency declaration that underpinned the president's massive global reciprocal tariff program.
Okay, hold on. A Senate vote. 51-47. That sounds close. And repealing a national emergency, that probably wouldn't get through the House, maybe faces a veto anyway. So why should the business community or, the markets care so much? Isn't this just sort of political theater?
It is absolutely not just theater for a few key reasons. First, look at the vote breakdown. 4 Republicans joined all the Democrats in this rebuke.
4 Republicans breaking ranks. That's notable.
Very notable. And importantly, this wasn't a one-off. It was actually the third such challenge to the administration's tariff authority that week, following earlier votes targeting specific duties on Canada and Brazil. So what you're seeing is a clear pattern, a demonstration of significant bipartisan unease with the sweeping use of executive power, specifically these national emergency declarations, to impose tariffs across the board.
So the signal being sent by the Senate is strong, even if the immediate legislative outcome is uncertain.
Critically strong. This vote sets up, or maybe deepens, a profound separation of powers clash over who ultimately controls U.S. trade policy. Is it the president, using broad emergency powers, or is it Congress, using its constitutional authority?
And how did the business world react? They've been complaining about these tariffs for a while.
Right. Business groups who had been warning all year about the inflationary effects of these tariffs, the supply chain disruptions, the retaliatory tariffs from other countries, they immediately applauded the Senate move.
Why? If it wasn't going to become law immediately.
Because it signals a potential shift, a move back toward more traditional legislative oversight of trade. They see it as strengthening their hand, potentially opening the door to challenge the legal basis of these tariffs more effectively in court. It sends a message that congressional support for this broad tariff approach is eroding.
But presumably, the administration's supporters, the terror hawks, saw it differently.
Oh, absolutely. They immediately argued the opposite, that Congress was essentially weakening U.S. leverage, undermining the president right at the moment he was trying to negotiate this major truce with China in Busan. They framed it as congressional interference, hamstringing the executive branch's ability to conduct foreign economic policy.
So a real tug of war over policy and power.
Exactly. But the legislative signal from the Senate is clear. There's significant pressure building for the administration to maybe pivot towards narrower, more targeted, perhaps negotiated trade actions, rather than relying so heavily on these broad national emergency declarations that bypass Congress. Even without becoming law right away, that Senate vote significantly informs the legal and political environment. It increases the legal risk for the administration's tariff program moving forward, especially with cases likely heading towards the Supreme Court.
Okay, so let's just step back for a second and look at the U.S. political picture on this single day. You've got the executive branch preparing for a potential nuclear arms escalation, fighting a global trade war via tariffs, facing legislative pushback on those tariffs. And yet, the basic functioning of the federal government itself is paralyzed. We had a government shutdown dragging into its 30th day on October 30th.
That's right, a full month. And this is where that collision we talked about between huge strategic decisions and paralyzing domestic gridlock hit hardest. It hit the most vulnerable Americans directly.
And the stalemate was fundamentally overfunding bills, right? Basic appropriations to keep the government running.
Yes, specifically those covering social programs and health spending. There was a complete impasse between the White House, the House, and the Senate over spending levels and policy riders attached to those bills.
And amidst this, the institutional maneuvering was pretty intense, too. The president was publicly pressing Senate Republicans to use the so-called nuclear option.
Right, urging them to eliminate the 60-vote filibuster threshold for spending bills so they can pass a purely Republican funding bill with just 51 votes, cutting out the Democrats entirely.
Which would be a major break with Senate tradition, another escalation, but this time on the domestic political front.
A huge break. And that push was happening publicly, even as the Senate ultimately adjourned that day with no breakthrough on the shutdown. So you had this institutional warfare being waged, these norms being threatened, while the real-world human cost was mounting catastrophically.
Because October 30th, that specific day, coincided precisely with the expiration of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP benefits, for over 40 million Americans.
40 million people. Let that number sink in.
This wasn't just, a policy debate anymore. This instantly became a rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis right here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of SNAP? What does it mean for 40 million people to lose it?
SNAP, historically known as food stamps, is absolutely massive. It's the cornerstone of nutritional support for low-income individuals and families, seniors, children, people with disabilities, low-wage workers. When those benefits expire suddenly, especially after a month-long shutdown where state contingency funds might also be running low, it means families instantly lose a significant portion, maybe all, of their ability to buy food.
It's catastrophic.
It is a catastrophic failure of governance. 40 million Americans losing this benefit all at once. The scale is almost hard to comprehend.
And there was an attempt to prevent this specific crisis, wasn't there? A targeted bill.
There was. Senate Democrats brought forward a bill specifically aimed at extending and funding just the SNAP benefits to avert this immediate cliff. But Senate Majority Leader John Thune, a Republican, blocked that bill from coming to a vote.
Blocked it.
Yeah.
Cementing the impasse on that crucial day.
That maneuver sealed the fate for those 40 million people, at least for that day and the immediate future. And the real-world impact was immediate and devastating, according to reports flooding in. Food banks across the country, already strained by the shutdown, became instantly overwhelmed. Lines grew longer, shelves emptied faster. They simply couldn't cope with the sudden surge in need.
And state governments had to step in.
Yes. Governors, like Kathy Hochul in New York was mentioned specifically, were forced to declare states of emergency. They warned of impending hunger crises, activating state resources where they could, but acknowledging the scale was beyond state capacity alone. They warned about the long-term consequences, not just immediate hunger, but impacts on children's health and development, educational outcomes, long-term economic stability for families pushed deeper into poverty.
So the political fight in Washington, the stalemate over funding levels and institutional procedures like the filibuster, was directly paid for by millions of citizens losing their most basic ability to feed their families.
That's the brutal reality of October 30th on the domestic front. Hashtag 1.4 judicial context.
And as if this intense clash between the executive branch trying to exert power and the legislative branch either pushing back or being stuck in gridlock wasn't enough, the third branch of government, the judiciary, was also quietly in the background getting ready.
That's right. You always have to watch the courts in these situations. Amidst all the noise, the nuclear order, the tariff fight, the shutdown chaos, Supreme Court reporting on October 30th specifically flagged new briefing orders being issued and tracking case movements,
Cases related to what?
directly related to challenges involving the scope of presidential powers. The sources mentioned ongoing legal battles over the emergency declaration used for the tariffs. Was that a legitimate use of emergency power? And also, specifically, challenges related to the president's authority over deploying the National Guard, which had been another point of friction.
So the wheels of justice were turning, preparing to potentially rule on the very controversies that were exploding that day.
Precisely. It's a reminder that many of the biggest conflicts we saw play out on October 30th, the reach of executive power on trade, the use of emergency declarations, wouldn't be ultimately resolved by Congress or the White House alone. They were inevitably heading for judicial review.
So the courts would likely have the final say on the legality of some of these major administration actions.
In many cases, yes. What we saw that day was kind of a snapshot of the whole system under stress. The executive escalating actions, the legislature resisting or deadlocked, and the judiciary quietly preparing for the inevitable legal showdowns over the separation of powers. Okay, so let's pivot now. Let's transition from that picture of internal U.S. conflict, the executive power plays, versus the domestic gridlock, and look at how U.S. actions and inaction were reverberating globally on October 30th. Because what's really remarkable about this specific day is the simultaneous occurrence of seeming de-escalation in one really key theater, alongside intensified tragedy and conflict in others.
A real mix of signals being sent around the world. And maybe the best place to start is with those contradictory outcomes from the U.S. China summit in Busan, South Korea. As you mentioned, this was President Trump and President Xi Jinping's first in-person meeting of the year, happening just hours after that nuclear testing order went public. Talk about a charged atmosphere.
Extremely charged. Yet, despite that backdrop, the main headline coming out of Busan was undeniably a short-term trade truce. It was explicitly designed, or at least framed, as an effort to cool the escalating economic tensions between the two superpowers.
What did the truce actually involve? What were the concrete steps?
It involved a few things, according to the readouts. China apparently agreed to pause some of its recently imposed export restrictions, particularly on certain critical minerals. The U.S. agreed to lower duties on certain Chinese goods. There were also familiar promises of increased Chinese purchases of American agricultural and energy products, and renewed pledges of cooperation on combating the flow of fentanyl precursors from China.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like progress, right? Lowering tariffs, pausing restrictions. The markets must have liked that initially.
They did. There was an initial sigh of relief in financial markets. Anything that pulled back from the brink of an all-out trade war was seen as positive in the short term.
But the analysis that followed almost immediately poured cold water on the idea that this was some kind of major breakthrough, didn't it? Analysts were calling it a thaw, but not a fix. Why that immediate caution?
Because when you looked closely, while the deal offered some temporary relief on trade flows, the core fundamental disputes between the U.S. and China remained entirely unresolved. Untouched, really.
What disputes are we talking about? The big ones.
Exactly, the deep structural issues. We're talking about fundamental disagreements over technology transfer, intellectual property theft, China's industrial subsidies that distort markets, U.S. export controls on advanced technology like semiconductors, and of course the broader geopolitical and security competition in the Indo-Pacific. None of that was really addressed in this truce.
So it was more like a pause button on some of the immediate economic pain rather than a resolution of the underlying conflict.
That's a good way to put it. It was perhaps a tactical de-escalation, maybe driven by domestic pressures in both countries, but it did little to resolve the strategic rivalry. It papered over the cracks, but the cracks are still there and they're deep.
So a diplomatic win for the optics, maybe, showed they could still talk. But the durability of this truce was immediately questioned.
Absolutely. Analysts were quick to point out how fragile it likely was. It would be severely tested by ongoing domestic politics in both the U.S. and China, and by those parallel strategic moves, like the U.S. continuing to tighten export controls, aimed squarely at limiting China's access to the technologies needed for AI and advanced computing. The truce felt more like a temporary cooling mechanism, a tactical pause, not a genuine long-term strategic realignment. Hashtag Tag 2.2 intensifying conflicts and infrastructure warfare.
Okay, so while that high-level, albeit fragile, diplomacy was playing out in South Korea, elsewhere, particularly in Ukraine, the brutal reality of kinetic warfare intensified dramatically on October 30th. Russia launched what sources described as one of the war's largest aerial barrages to date.
Yeah, this was a major escalation in the air war. We're talking hundreds of drones, mostly the Shahed-type kamikaze drones, and dozens of missiles, including cruise and ballistic missiles, launched against targets across Ukraine. The focus was clearly on energy infrastructure.
Hitting power plants again.
Yes, specifically targeting thermal power plants, electrical substations, and other critical nodes of the energy grid, as well as some civilian areas. The clear strategic goal here seemed to be degrading Ukraine's industrial capacity and imposing hardship on the civilian population as winter approached. It's a strategy of infrastructure warfare.
And what was the immediate result on the ground in Ukraine?
The immediate result was severe disruption. Ukraine's national energy operator had to impose sweeping nationwide power restrictions, scheduled blackouts, emergency shutdowns just to stabilize the grid and prevent a total collapse. It highlighted again just how acutely vulnerable Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure remained to these large-scale, sustained aerial attacks despite air defenses.
And that intense pressure from the air was mirrored by fierce fighting on the ground, wasn't it? Particularly in the eastern Donetsk region, around the strategically important city of Pokrovsk.
That's right. Pokrovsk had become a major flashpoint. Urban fighting there intensified dramatically on October 30th.
Why is Pokrovsk so critical?
It's a key logistics hub. It has vital rail links and road networks that are crucial for supplying Ukrainian forces fighting along the Eastern Front. Losing Pokrovsk would be a major blow, both militarily and symbolically.
And the fighting was intense.
Reports described incredibly intense, close-quarters urban combat. Ukrainian commanders confirmed they were heavily reinforcing the city's defenses, actively countering Russian claims that they had the city nearly encircled. Both sides were throwing significant resources into this battle.
And one of the technologies mentioned prominently in the sources regarding the Pokrovsk fighting was the heavy use of FPV drones. Can you explain what those are and why they're so significant in this kind of urban fight?
Yeah, FPV stands for first-person view. These are essentially small, agile, often commercially available racing drones that have been modified, usually fairly crudely, to carry an explosive payload like an RPG warhead or a grenade.
So like a mini kamikaze drone, but controlled directly by a soldier.
Exactly. The operator wears goggles that receive a live video feed directly from a camera on the drone, giving them that first-person view as if they were sitting in the cockpit. This allows for incredibly precise maneuvering, flying through windows, down trenches, hitting moving vehicles or individual soldiers hiding in buildings.
And they're cheap compared to missiles.
Much cheaper, and available in large quantities. They've become a defining feature of the battlefield in Ukraine, particularly effective in complex urban environments where traditional artillery or air support might struggle or cause too much collateral damage. They give infantry squads a kind of precision strike capability they never had before.
So the battle for Pokrovsk, heavily featuring these FPV drones, was really a microcosm of the grinding, high-tech nature of the war on October 30th. Control of that city was clearly hanging in the balance.
Very much so. It held immense military and... Yeah, the ceasefire felt like it was hanging by a thread that day. It was severely tested, most notably by a series of Israeli airstrikes. Specifically, reports emerged of Israeli jets bombarding the Khan Yunis area in southern Gaza.
And the casualties were high.
Tragically high. According to reports from Palestinian health officials cited in the sources, these strikes resulted in the deaths of over 100 people. And devastatingly, that number included 46 children.
46 children, that's horrific.
It's a staggering number, and it drew immediate and widespread international condemnation. The sheer scale of the reported civilian casualties, especially among minors, put immense pressure on the ceasefire.
And inevitably, these incidents fuel competing narratives, right? How did each side frame it?
Predictably, yes. The Israeli military defended the strikes, stating they were targeting suspected militant infrastructure hidden within civilian areas. They emphasized precision and the necessity of countering ongoing threats, framing it within a counterterrorism context. On the other side, Palestinian officials vehemently condemned the strikes as indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations, accusing Israel of violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the temporary truce.
So accusations flying back and forth, even as the ceasefire was technically holding.
Exactly. And adding to the complexity and the sort of grim nature of the day, amidst this violence, some painful diplomatic exchanges were still continuing, albeit in a very somber way. On the very same day as the Khan Yunis bombardment, militants in Gaza returned the bodies of 2 deceased Israeli hostages.
Oh, wow.
And that was followed shortly by Israel transferring the bodies of 30 Palestinians previously held by Israel back to authorities in Gaza.
So an exchange of remains happening alongside active bombardment.
Yes, an incredibly agonizing process for all the families involved on both sides. But it highlighted just how tenuously that truce was holding this bizarre, fragile mix of lethal violence and these very difficult, painful diplomatic steps related to the deceased.
And how did the wider world react to this flare-up?
Global reaction was swift and alarmed. The United Nations, the European Union, the Arab League, they all issued urgent calls for restraint, for renewed diplomatic efforts to salvage the ceasefire. They warned explicitly against a catastrophic slide back into wider, full-scale hostilities, which felt dangerously close on that day. Hashtag tag 2.4 humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan.
And finally, shifting focus again geographically, a truly catastrophic humanitarian disaster was unfolding in Sudan on October 30th. One that was maybe tragically overshadowed by the headlines from Ukraine, Gaza, and the U.S. China summit, but had absolutely massive regional implications.
Yes, this was the fall of El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur State, to the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. This followed an intense and brutal siege that had lasted for weeks.
Why was the fall of El Fasher so significant?
It was hugely significant for several reasons. El Fasher was the last major regional capital in Darfur that was not under RSF control. It was held by the Sudanese armed forces and allied groups. Crucially, it had also become a major hub for displaced people, sheltering hundreds of thousands who had fled fighting elsewhere in Darfur. Its fall represented a major strategic victory for the RSF and a devastating blow to the army and the civilian population.
And the reports coming out about the humanitarian toll during and after the city fell.
They were horrific. Initial reports confirmed the deaths of at least 2,000 people just in the final days of the siege and the immediate aftermath. Eyewitnesses who managed to escape described scenes of mass killings, widespread looting, and targeted attacks, including, chillingly, reports of attacks inside the main hospital, forcing medical staff to flee for their lives.
Mass killings, attacks on hospitals. Human rights organizations must have sounded the alarm immediately.
They did, loudly. Several prominent human rights groups immediately warned that the violence, particularly the reports of ethnically targeted killings, bore the disturbing hallmarks of potential ethnic cleansing, echoing the previous atrocities committed in Darfur 2 decades earlier.
A terrifying echo of the past.
Deeply terrifying. The UN issued urgent calls for immediate, unimpeded humanitarian access to the area and for the protection of civilians trapped there. They expressed extreme fear that the fall of El Fasher and the scale of the ensuing violence could fatally destabilize Sudan's already incredibly fragile transitional government, potentially plunging the entire country into even deeper chaos.
And the regional impact.
Massive. The fall of the city triggered another huge wave of displacement, pushing tens of thousands more desperate people across the border into neighboring Chad, which was already struggling to cope with existing refugee flows. It dramatically worsened the regional humanitarian crisis and raised fears of the conflict spilling over borders. The failure of the international community to prevent the fall of al-Fashir, despite weeks of warnings, really stands as a profound illustration of extreme state fragility compounding a humanitarian disaster on an absolutely massive scale.
Okay, so all this turbulence we've just covered,
Yeah.
the nuclear orders shaking up global strategy, the fragile trade truces, the intensifying wars in Ukraine and Sudan, the violence in Gaza, all fed right back into the financial markets on October 30th. Investors were trying to process all this geopolitical risk, and while they might have been initially buoyed by that U.S. China truce.
That optimism faded pretty quickly. It was really eclipsed by a new, growing uncertainty, maybe even fear about the true, staggering cost of the artificial intelligence arms race among the major tech companies.
So how did the markets actually perform that day?
Wall Street slipped significantly from the record highs it had been flirting with. The S&P 500 index fell about 1%, and the Nasdaq, which is heavily weighted towards those big technology stocks, dropped more sharply, roughly 1.6%.
And what was driving that pullback? Just the geopolitical uncertainty?
It was a combination of factors. Investors were definitely digesting that complex cocktail of risks we've been talking about. The domestic policy uncertainty here in the U.S., the ongoing shutdown, the unresolved tariff fight. But critically, it was combined with mixed and, in some cases, frankly, terrifying corporate guidance coming out from some of the biggest players in technology, especially around their future spending plans. Hashtag 3.2 Amazon and the Anthropic windfall.
Okay, let's get to that tech guidance. But maybe let's start with a positive outlier first. Amazon seemed to have a good day, results-wise.
Yes, Amazon was a bright spot, relatively speaking. They actually topped Wall Street expectations for their third quarter 2025 results, reporting a very healthy net income of $21.2 billion.
What were the key drivers behind that strong performance?
The main engine, as usual, was Amazon Web Services, AWS, their cloud computing division. AWS revenue jumped a strong 20% year over year, reaching $33 billion for the quarter. And interestingly, Amazon attributed this growth directly to a reacceleration in demand driven by new AI workloads from their enterprise customers. So AI was actually helping their bottom line immediately.
So companies using AWS to run their own AI models.
Exactly. And there was another really specific financial nugget in their results that highlighted just how lucrative some of these strategic AI bets were becoming, even indirectly. They reported a substantial, non-operational $9.5 billion pre-tax gain.
$9.5 billion. From what?
Tied directly to the rising value of Amazon's significant investment in Anthropic, the prominent AI research firm that competes with OpenAI.
Wow. So their investment in an AI company paid off massively on paper.
Massively. It reinforced the narrative that Amazon was not just surviving the AI wave, but actively benefiting from it, both through AWS demand and its strategic investments.
Yeah.
The bulls were pointing to impressive operating leverage, their ability to grow revenue faster than operating expenses, and clearly seeing massive immediate demand related to AI.
But even with those strong results, were there any cautionary notes from Amazon?
Yes, even Amazon's generally positive report included hints about their own future capital expenditure plans moving into 2026. While they were benefiting from AI now, they also signaled they would need to continue investing heavily to keep up. And that theme of massive future investment brings us squarely to the spending shock delivered by their competitors, hashtag 3.3, Meta's spending shock, the cost of superintelligence.
Right. Because Meta, Facebook's parent company, their Q3 results and guidance really seemed to rattle the markets, didn't they? Caused a double-digit drop in their stock price, even though their actual quarterly results, the top-line growth, were pretty solid.
That's exactly right. The results themselves weren't the disaster. The problem was the forward-looking guidance, specifically around spending. Management signaled sharply, and frankly shockingly, higher future capital spending CapEx for the coming years.
Higher spending on what specifically?
Specifically earmarked for building out massive new AI data centers and funding what the company explicitly referred to as its long-term superintelligence research efforts. They put a huge future price tag on achieving artificial general intelligence, or something close to it.
And that massive future spending plan just spooked investors. Why? Isn't investing in the future, in cutting-edge tech like superintelligence, supposed to be a good thing for a tech company?
You'd think so, but this really underscored the central debate, the key anxiety gripping investors when it comes to AI right now. The market is basically asking two critical questions about these colossal AI investments.
Okay, what are they?
First, how quickly will these billions, potentially tens or hundreds of billions, actually translate into durable, reliable cash flows and profits? Is there a clear path to monetization, or is it just a massive R&D expense for now?
And the second question.
The second is about the risk of execution failure. These superintelligence efforts are incredibly ambitious, essentially very expensive long-term R&D projects with uncertain outcomes. What if Meta spends all this money and Google or Microsoft OpenAI or even a smaller player gets there first or builds a better model?
Ah, so it's the scale of the bet and the uncertainty of the payoff.
Precisely. The market fears either non-monetizable R&D or just immense pressure on profit margins if the monetization lags behind the spending. The capital required is so astronomical, building custom chips, securing energy for data centers, that it fundamentally changes the company's financial profile, eating into immediate cash flow and profitability projections. Investors got scared by the sheer size of the check Meta seemed willing to write. Hashtag 3.4 Alphabet and the shared capex pressure.
And it wasn't just Meta, right? Alphabet, Google's parent company, also contributed to this sense of an AI spending arms race, even though their own Q3 numbers looked pretty good initially.
That's right. Alphabet actually posted strong Q3 numbers overall. Their revenue was up a healthy 16% year over year to $102.3 billion, driven mainly by resilient advertising demand and, importantly, improving profitability in their Google Cloud division, which is also benefiting from AI workloads.
So their stock should have done well.
It rallied initially on the results, but then during their earnings call, Alphabet's management team essentially echoed Meta's message. They also announced plans for significantly higher capital outlays in the coming years, specifically for AI infrastructure servers, data centers, specialized processors.
So confirmation that everyone is spending big.
Exactly. It crystallized this narrative of a full-blown big tech arms race in AI capex. The commitment required from all the major players, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, is just enormous. These multi-year investment plans are set to fundamentally reshape the cash flow profiles of these dominant tech companies throughout 2026 and 2027, maybe beyond.
So it's not just about having the smartest algorithms anymore. It's about having the biggest, most powerful computing infrastructure to train and run them.
That's becoming increasingly clear. It's a generational resource commitment. It's a battle fought with silicon and electricity as much as with code. Who can afford to build and power the infrastructure needed to win the technological race towards more powerful AI?
And just to round out the big tech picture that day, Apple also reported earnings, right? How did they fit into this narrative?
Yeah, Apple also released its fiscal Q4 results on October 30th and declared a dividend. They factored into the day's tech narrative in a slightly different way.
How?
While Apple is obviously deeply engaged in incorporating AI into its products and services, their report and commentary perhaps provided a slight counterbalance to the frenzied spending announcements from Meta and Alphabet. They offered a sense of stability through their dividend and focused investor attention also on more traditional concerns, like the cyclical nature of iPhone sales and device upgrades.
So maybe a bit more cautious, balancing the AI enthusiasm with existing business realities?
Perhaps, or maybe just a different stage in their AI investment cycle. But the overall message coming out of Silicon Valley on October 30th was unmistakable. The future is seen as AI supremacy, but the price of admission to that race is going to be absolutely astronomical for everyone involved. Okay, so we've covered the big geopolitical moves, the wars, the economic shockwaves. But October 30th also contained important updates on those critical ongoing global issues that maybe don't always grab the top headline, but have profound long-term implications for global stability and human welfare. Things like climate change impacts and public health vigilance.
Right, the slower burn crises that are always there in the background. Let's start with a major weather event. Hurricane Melissa. This wasn't just a minor storm.
No, not at all. Melissa was a powerful late-season hurricane that rapidly intensified in the Caribbean. It ultimately made devastating landfalls or near landfalls impacting parts of Jamaica, Cuba, and especially the Bahamas. It brought destructive winds, life-threatening storm surge, and torrential rainfall causing widespread flooding.
And there were fatalities.
Sadly, yes. Initial reports confirmed at least 34 deaths across the affected islands. The damage, particularly in Jamaica and the Bahamas, was described as truly extensive. Entire communities were cut off. Infrastructure like roads and power grids was severely damaged, leading to widespread and prolonged power outages.
And the recovery effort sounds like it would be immense.
Absolutely. Aid groups on the ground immediately warned of incredibly complex and prolonged recovery needs across multiple Caribbean nations. They were dealing with immediate needs like shelter, food, and clean water, but also the long-term challenge of rebuilding homes and infrastructure.
And this kind of event inevitably sparks broader conversations, doesn't it? Beyond just the immediate disaster response.
It really does. The devastation from Melissa immediately revived intense debates about climate resilience, especially for vulnerable, small island developing states. How do they adapt? How do they fund adaptation? It also fueled discussions about the increasing frequency and intensity of climate-driven extreme weather events, these so-called superstorms becoming more common in the Atlantic basin later into the season.
And the economic impact on those island economies must be huge.
Devastating and persistent. Many rely heavily on tourism, agriculture, fisheries, all sectors incredibly vulnerable to hurricanes. Rebuilding takes years and diverts resources from other development priorities.
And Melissa's impact wasn't just confined to the Caribbean, was it? It tracked northwards.
That's right. As the storm system moved north, even as it weakened, it pulled deep tropical moisture with it, sending heavy rain bands sweeping into the U.S. Northeast. This caused significant severe weather, flash flooding, and major travel disruption across the region.
How bad was the travel disruption?
Pretty bad. The sources noted nearly 6,000 flight delays or cancellations across major airport hubs like New York City and Boston on October 30th, directly attributed to the weather system spawned by Melissa's remnants.
6,000 flights. That's a major snarl.
It really is. And interestingly, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, reportedly noted that these widespread delays were actually exacerbated by a pre-existing challenge, a critical shortage of certified air traffic controllers at key facilities. So the storm chaos essentially collided with and amplified an underlying systemic vulnerability in the U.S. air travel system. Hashtag 4.2 climate finance gap ahead of COP30.
Okay, sticking with the theme of long-term climate concerns, the United Nations was also active on October 30th, looking ahead to the big annual climate summit, COP30, scheduled for Belém, Brazil, the following month.
Yes, the UN Environment Program, UNEP, released some important fact sheets and preparatory documents that day, basically setting the stage for the negotiations, and the message was frankly quite sobering.
Sobering in what way? What was the main warning?
The key finding, highlighted across the reports, was about climate finance, specifically adaptation finance. That's the money needed to help developing countries, the ones often least responsible for climate change but most vulnerable to its impacts, cope with the unavoidable effects, things like sea level rise, drought, extreme weather.
And the finding was that there isn't enough money.
Not even close. The report stated that the amount of adaptation finance currently flowing to developing countries remains an order of magnitude below what studies show is actually needed. We're talking tens, maybe hundreds of billions short per year.
An order of magnitude, that's a huge gap.
A massive gap. And furthermore, UNEP warned that the current national pledges submitted by countries under the Paris Agreement, their commitments to cut emissions still fall drastically short of what's needed to keep global warming limited to the crucial 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. We're still heading for much more dangerous levels of warming based on current policies.
Okay, let's unpack that finance gap a bit. Why should someone listening, maybe in a developed country, care deeply about adaptation finance for developing nations? What are the wider implications if that gap isn't closed?
It's crucial because the failure to adequately fund adaptation isn't just a problem over there. It has direct and indirect consequences that affect global stability for everyone.
Such as?
Well, first, it undermines basic infrastructure resilience in vulnerable countries. Think roads, ports, power grids, water systems being damaged or destroyed by climate impacts. That hinders economic development and trade. Second, it increases sovereign credit risk for those nations, making it harder and more expensive for them to borrow money for anything, potentially leading to debt crises.
Okay, economic instability. What else?
It severely stresses public health systems as they try to cope with heat waves, changing disease patterns, and malnutrition. And critically, it acts as a major driver of migration and displacement. When regions become uninhabitable due to drought or sea level rise, or when agriculture fails and people can't support themselves, they are forced to move, often across borders, which can create social and political instability elsewhere.
So failing on adaptation finance isn't just a humanitarian issue, it's a security issue, an economic issue, a migration issue.
Exactly. It interconnects with almost everything. The clear message from UNEP on October 30th was that this persistent gap between the rhetoric of support and the actual resources being provided is fundamentally undermining global resilience and storing up much bigger problems for the future.
All right, let's shift to public health now. Even with major geopolitical events unfolding, global health organizations have to maintain constant vigilance. The World Health Organization, the WHO, published an update on Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, on October 30th.
That's right. They released Situation Report #59, which detailed the ongoing multi-country Mpox landscape. The key takeaway was that while the global emergency declared in 2022 was over, the virus hadn't disappeared and continued vigilance was absolutely necessary.
Were there any specific areas of concern highlighted in the report?
Yes, there were two main points of immediate concern. First, a noted resurgence of cases in certain parts of Africa where the virus is endemic in animal populations and can spill over to humans. Second, the continued reappearance of cases globally, often linked to international travel, forming new transmission chains in countries outside Africa.
And was there concern about specific strains or variants?
Yes, and this was a key point. The report specifically mentioned the continued detection and emergence of clade R variants in some of these outbreaks, particularly those originating in Central Africa.
Okay, remind us, how are the clade R variants different from the clade R variants that caused the big global outbreak starting in 2022? And why are they considered more concerning?
So, Mpox virus has two main genetic clades, or families. Clade 2, particularly subclade IB, was responsible for the vast majority of cases in the 2022 global outbreak, which spread primarily through close personal contact, often sexual contact. While serious, Clade 2 generally causes less severe disease and has a lower mortality rate, estimated well below 1%.
And clade 1.
Clade 1, historically associated more with outbreaks in the Congo Basin region of Central Africa, has often been linked to more severe disease outcomes. It can potentially have a higher mortality rate, historically estimated as high as 10% in some settings, though that can vary greatly depending on access to healthcare. The concern is that if clade time establishes sustained human-to-human transmission globally via travel, it could pose a more significant public health threat than the clade tite outbreak did.
So the detection of clade in travel-associated cases is a definite red flag.
It requires immediate and robust public health responses, yes. As a result, public health authorities in various countries, including the U.S. sources mentioned, New York City specifically issued advisories around October 30th, reminding healthcare providers and the public about the potential for continued local transmission and imported cases, stressing the need for immediate testing and caution.
So the emphasis remains firmly on prevention, especially with travel picking up.
Exactly. The experts stressed the ongoing need for targeted vaccination efforts, particularly focusing on reaching high-risk communities who may not have been vaccinated during the initial 2022 push. Alongside that, rapid case finding, contact tracing, and clear risk communication remain crucial, especially reminding people to be aware of symptoms and take precautions ahead of the upcoming holiday travel season and large indoor gatherings, which could potentially create conditions for renewed spread. Hashtag 4.4 other key global developments. And just to round out this incredibly busy day, October 30th, we should briefly touch on a few other significant global developments that were reported, just to show the sheer geographic diversity of the events unfolding simultaneously.
Right, because the world doesn't stop turning just because the U.S. and China are talking or Russia's attacking Ukraine. What else was happening?
Well, over in European politics, preliminary results were coming in from the Dutch general elections. And interestingly, they showed the far-right anti-immigrant Freedom Party, led by Geert Wilders, actually losing seats compared to previous polls, ending in a near tie with other parties.
How is that being interpreted?
Early analysis suggested this might signal a potential weakening, or at least a plateauing, of the populist far-right momentum that had been seen surging in several key European countries. It offered a bit of temporary relief, perhaps, to centrist political parties across the continent.
Okay. What else? Any institutional news?
Yes, a significant development within the British monarchy. King Charles III took the decisive step of stripping his brother, Prince Andrew, of all his remaining royal duties and honorary titles. This marked the harshest disciplinary action taken against Andrew following the years of controversy and misconduct allegations related to his association with Jeffrey Epstein. A final, formal severing of ties.
A major move for the monarchy's image and accountability. Elsewhere.
Diplomatically, at the United Nations, the General Assembly held its annual vote on the U.S. economic embargo against Cuba. And, as expected, it voted overwhelmingly for the 33rd consecutive year to condemn the embargo, citing ongoing humanitarian concerns and the negative impact on the Cuban people's development and well-being. A consistent global rebuke of U.S. policy.
33 years running. That's consistency. And any unrest to note.
Yes, unfortunately in Tanzania, protests continued there over disputed recent election results. The government's response escalated significantly on October 30th as they took the extreme measure of shutting down internet access across large parts of the country in an attempt to suppress dissent and control information flow.
Shutting down the internet, that's a worrying sign.
Very worrying. It drew immediate and strong alarm from the African Union and human rights groups, who warned about the escalating violence surrounding the protests and the significant risks of broader regional destabilization if the situation wasn't de-escalated quickly. Just another flashpoint on a day full of them. Hashtag tag outro.
So as we try to pull all these threads together from this single intense day, October 30th, 2025, what stands out most? For me, it has to be that jarring velocity of contradictory events. You had this sense of deep domestic paralysis in the U.S., the shutdown, the filibuster fight, the absolutely staggering SNAP crisis hitting millions, contrasting so sharply with the sheer speed and scale of global escalation happening at the exact same time.
Yeah, that contrast is key. The nuclear testing order, the massive Russian barrage in Ukraine, the fall of El Fasher in Sudan, these were huge, fast-moving, high-stakes events.
While at home, the government couldn't even agree to keep feeding its own citizens.
And that brings us back to that central tension we identified at the start. You see political leaders seemingly relying on these fragile, short-term thaws and truces, like at the trade deal with China, hoping to manage immediate crises. But simultaneously, they are committing their nations, their resources, to these incredibly resource-intensive, long-term conflicts and competitions.
You mean the renewed arms race in physical weapons,
Hmm.
like nuclear testing?
Exactly. And also the equally intense economic and technological arms race being waged through these astronomical AI CapEx investments we talked about, billions pouring into that.
So it feels like the fragility of global stability is being tested from multiple angles at once, pushed and pulled by these simultaneous, often contradictory pressures.
Severely tested. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Which brings us, I think, to our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on after this deep dive. Think about those two massive commitments made or highlighted on October 30th. The unprecedented order to resume nuclear testing after 33 years, and the simultaneous reveal of the absolutely astronomical multi-billion-dollar investments big tech is pouring in to AI infrastructure, specifically chasing this goal of superintelligence.
Two huge bets on the future of power and security.
Exactly. So here's the question. If the very definition of national security is rapidly shifting, maybe moving away from solely physical deterrence, like nuclear warheads hidden underground, towards technological supremacy, towards AI superintelligence housed in these massive power-hungry data centers, how will the global community ever hope to regulate or even understand a strategic arms race that is now being fought simultaneously underground and in the cloud?
A race in atoms and bits happening at the same time, with maybe even fewer rules for the latter.
What stands out to you about this day of irreversible decisions and stark contradictions? We encourage you to look deeper into those sources, find your own anchor points in this complex picture.